Currently, we are experiencing the first crash after the massive franchise wave, with Marvel movies not performing like they used to, an oversaturation of content, and a commercial need to make everything a franchise, allowing an audience to read, watch, play, listen to every aspect of a universe in order to keep up with it has made people really tired. Now, this is obviously due to one particular franchise, but we'll get to that later. We're 2 months into 2024 and I've already seen the release and announcements of a live-action Avatar show, Madam Web, the announcement of a Fantastic Four movie that's not going to come out for another year probably, and also a trailer for a completely unnecessary Borderlands movie. Franchise media is more concerned with getting you to subscribe to all of these different media services because getting you involved with known IP is much easier than original content. With all of these franchises fighting for our attention, I think it's time we look at what happens once a franchise has done its course. Today we're going to talk specifically about jumping the shark. Jumping the shark is a term that originated in television, but what is a franchise if not a really big TV show? So I think it still applies to this example. Jumping the shark refers to an episode of Happy Days, which is an old sitcom that came out a long time ago. Hang on, I'll look it up. 1974. 1974? There is this episode of Happy Days where Fonzie, one of the characters, jumps over a shark, and it's often regarded as the moment that show lost its core values. And so this term, jumping the shark, refers to when specifically a TV show reaches a peak where it's no longer what it used to be. It has reached the height of its popularity and also of its quality, and has now noticeably dipped as the producers resort to cheap tricks in order to keep people excited. Happy Days isn't about jumping over sharks, it's about people. There are more modern examples of this. There's another term called nuking the fridge, which comes from Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull, where Indiana Jones survives a nuclear blast by hiding in a fridge. For many, that was the moment that Indiana Jones lost that human nature that was at the core of the Indiana Jones franchise and resorted to kind of a level of logic that was outside of what existed from the rest of the movies. So nuking the fridge, jumping the shark, the idea is that a franchise or TV show has lost its quality and is instead resorting to commercial tricks in order to keep an audience engaged. Now, obviously, that applies very well to most modern franchises, which are expanding outside of just one specific medium. I would argue that nowadays, the best version of jumping the shark is making a tie-in property that exists in another medium. But why don't we talk specifically about where this term originated from and in sitcoms? I'm sure most of you have really memorable moments of sitcoms jumping the shark. The ones that come to mind for me is the finale of How I Met Your Mother, which reverts a lot of the development that happened in the later seasons. Also, Michael Scott leaving from The Office. As soon as Steve Carell leaves that show, the show definitely has a dip in quality and probably should have stopped airing. There's an idea that once a show jumps the shark, or once a franchise jumps the shark, the underlying message of that is that it doesn't need to continue anymore. It's purely existing more for commercial reasons. It's existing to make more money despite the fact that everyone working on the show, or some people working on the show, have done as much of it as they can. Now, this commercial need comes specifically in terms of franchise creep, where a lot of things nowadays are trying to quickly expand upon their licenses and their IP to generate franchises from properties purely for the sake of monetary value. There is not necessarily any need to remake, to remaster, to expand upon a world, except for making money. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, of course, and we'll get to that in the second half of this video. But for the most part, what I'm going to look today at are some key examples and some case studies of universes and franchises that expanded too quickly and jumped the shark before they even began. And of course, the first example that will come to everyone's mind is the Dark Universe. Now, the Dark Universe was announced just after the MCU was kind of reaching some heights. Dark Universe was Universal's monster franchise that they were going to create and have a bunch of tie-in movies about classic Universal monsters. It started with the remake of The Mummy with Tom Cruise. I'm pretty sure Tom Cruise was in that movie. I don't know. I didn't watch it, obviously. But The Mummy was the beginning of what would eventually become the Dark Universe franchise. They had all of these shoots and plans and films that were announced that were never made about what the Dark Universe would be. And the creep of franchise, they expanded so fast that because of how badly The Mummy performed, there was no way they were going to make any more of these movies. Now, obviously, the connection between these Universal monsters is rough to begin with. There's no need to make this into a franchise, but they did purely for the sake of hyping up this value, this franchise that can exist and can create more drama and interconnectedness in the cinema. People are trying to get people to come and watch more movies, and so they're borrowing from things like video games and TV shows to serialize the cinematic experience, to create these massive cinematic franchises that act almost as TV shows. The DCEU also tried to counteract the MCU by creating their own DC universe that was also very all over the place. It didn't have a clear, consistent vision. Franchise creep also stopped the DCU from being really what it could be. A lot of those DC movies were first and foremost designed to get people to come and watch them, rather than being good. The interconnectedness to lead up to Justice League was part of this idea of pretty much exactly copying the MCU's lead to Avengers. But when your motivation for making those movies is purely build up to the next film so we can get to this big team movie, you kind of stop actually making interesting films. The MCU didn't begin as this idea to create a franchise that happened organically. But again, we'll talk about that one later. Tie-in media also links to franchise incredibly, especially nowadays. Back in the day, there used to be these tie-in video games that were made for movies that were coming out. I remember I used to play the DS game of Up so much. I don't even remember how it played, but I used to play it because it was an easy way to get kids involved in the franchise of a movie that they like. It's commercial completely, and that tie-in video game added to the value of the movie. Now, it's interesting because the opposite has happened. Video games are the medium that generate the most income out of any at the moment. So instead of creating a tie-in video game for a movie, movies are trying to cash in on the video game market. We've seen a lot of tie-in films being made, and TV shows as well, about famous popular video game franchises to try and get people to get off of their console and watch TV or go to the cinema. What used to be a low-quality game for a movie has now become a low-quality movie for a game. Both of these are great examples of jumping the shark. The Halo show already proved that disregarding source material and just creating something that is not at all connected to the video games doesn't resonate very well with fans. If you want to learn more, I have a video about that as well. Their upcoming Fallout show is another example of something just trying to cash in on the video game market. Fallout as a concept is a lot about RPG and role-playing in that world. It'll be interesting to see whether or not a linear story in that world will actually be any good. And then, of course, the Borderlands trailer that just came out, which has gotten very severe negative reaction from people online because the movie doesn't look very good. Borderlands as well is a looter shooter. It's about shooting things. It's about having fun. And that movie doesn't look like fun at all, really. It's a shame because all the actors in that movie are great. They're all really weirdly cast, but again, it's a lot of star power. It's a lot of franchise ideas of, oh, you guys know Borderlands, come and watch this movie. But I don't know. I guess we'll see if anyone actually does. Obviously, there are good examples of both video games that have been based off good films that have been good and movies based on video games that have been good. The Last of Us came out last year and it was an incredible commercial success because of the ways in which it both remade the video game and also did its own thing. I think what made The Last of Us HBO show so great was the way in which it balanced both source material from the original game and also adding its unique ideas to what the game inferred. The Last of Us didn't jump the shark because it took its time. It understood the source material and didn't rush to make more of it, but rather enhance on what was already there. Season 2 will be the second game, and I guess we'll see whether or not it will be greenlit for Season 3 if they end up expanding the story outside what existed in the games. If they do, perhaps then they will jump the shark. And I guess HBO aren't unknown to jump the shark. Game of Thrones season, whatever that last season was, I can't remember if it was 8 or 9, jumped the shark absolutely in the way in which it kind of took all of these pieces that were placed in the seasons prior and just toppled them all to the ground. It quickly undid a lot of the development that was built up and what people loved about Game of Thrones and very quickly kind of just threw it to the wayside and rushed a very quick ending. CW shows suffer from the same thing. A lot of the CW superhero shows, the biggest CW show that I think jumped the shark was Riverdale. I always tell people that the moment I stopped watching Riverdale was when Archie fought a bear in the forest. That was a jump the shark moment from me. At that point, the show kind of lost what it was meant to be and had this massive campiness to it, which I'm sure if the show started like that, I would have enjoyed, but because it's so wildly shifted into this new direction, I was not on board anymore, and so I stopped watching. And obviously, there are massive franchises that jump the shark. Both Lord of the Rings and Star Wars have existed for decades, and they have both jumped the shark and come back from it multiple times before. Star Wars had its prequel era, which was a dip, which then eventually came from a rise from people like me who really like the prequels. The sequels have had their dip, but then The Mandalorian pulled it back up, so there have been moments where Disney jumped the shark with Star Wars releasing 3 Star Wars movies that were really unplanned. Lord of the Rings jumped the shark in the way that they created 3 Hobbit movies out of a book that was smaller than the first book, and yet they still extended it out into 3 films. Jumping the shark is very common in franchise entertainment. It's kind of the basis of what makes a franchise. Eventually, it gets to a point where a franchise expands to a level that's so large that the only thing that you can do is kind of create more commercial interest in that franchise. It's less about content and more about how do we use that content to get more money. But I guess now let's finally talk about what was the generator for what has become the franchise era in most media, and I think we finally need to talk about the MCU. The MCU has jumped the shark ever since Avengers Endgame happened. Multiple times the MCU has tried to create new opportunities, new moments to bring fans back in, but every time I feel like they are kind of losing focus of what made the MCU so great. There are good examples of MCU content post-Endgame, but an oversaturation of Marvel content has led to them jumping the shark. They've gotten too keen, they're releasing too much, and as a result, they're fatiguing their audience. A lot of what made Marvel so exciting in those early years was the staggered release of movies. The lead up to Avengers was 6 years long, but now it feels like the next Avengers movie is coming out in a year and a half, and we've been building non-stop for the past year. But I guess when we're talking about the MCU, I think we should go back to the original, what made it so great, and talk about the opposite effect. The opposite of jumping the shark, and that is a term called growing the beard. Growing the beard also comes from television and is basically the opposite effect, a show that increases in quality as it goes on. The term growing the beard comes specifically from Star Trek: The Next Generation. Most Star Trek shows are well known because of how atrocious their first seasons are, but as the seasons progress, they get better and better. This term then connects to the Star Trek Next Generation character William T. Riker, who in the first season of Star Trek is fully clean-shaven, but from season 2 has a full beard. Growing the beard refers to the maturity of a show, which increases in quality as it expands. Franchising happens the same way. There are actually many franchises that benefit greatly from additional expansion. The original Star Wars expanded universe added a bunch of new stories that weren't canon, and you didn't need to keep up with them in order to know what was happening in the universe, but added supplementary content for those interested. It's different from the MCU stuff where you feel like obligated to watch. You didn't have to read every single Star Wars expanded universe thing to understand what was happening, but if you wanted to delve into that world, you could. This counters franchise creep. By creating content that isn't required viewing, it expands upon the world and allows an audience to engage with as much or as little of it as they wanted to. When the prequels came out, people didn't need to have read everything to understand the prequels. I'm sure most people went and saw the prequels having just seen the original trilogy of movies. But for those who did expand their knowledge and learned more about it, they were rewarded by more interesting Easter eggs that existed within the prequel films. Other franchises that grew the beard, what about Breaking Bad, which as a show already increased in quality as it kept going, but then expanding into the movies like El Camino and the spin-off show Better Call Saul are also as quality as the original. They weren't created in a way to continue the franchise for the sake of monetary value, but for the sake of expanding the world and creating new, interesting stories within the context of Albuquerque. Adventure Time started in 2010 and then was cancelled in 2018, only to be revived by HBO in their kind of specials that they made, and now in the Fiona and Cake show. Adventure Time has matured as a show as it continued on and has now expanded itself into creating a bunch of different characters and a bunch of different worlds that exist within the same context of Adventure Time. I'll still watch anything that they put out because everything that they make is quality because they take their time with their storytelling. It isn't about rushing out a new season of a show, but rather taking the time to make sure that that new season of a show is very good. Growing the beard and jumping the shark often go hand in hand, where you feel like a show could be reaching a peak and then quickly drop off. I talked about Game of Thrones earlier. A lot of what you can say about Game of Thrones for the first few seasons is that it does grow the beard. It increases in quality as the show goes, but eventually reaches a point where they run out of ideas and jump the shark. Growing the beard can become a precursor or reaches a point where expansion feels like it becomes necessary for no reason. Fargo, one of my favorite shows of all time, never felt like it jumped the shark because each season expanded upon new ideas in an anthology type of way. Anthologies are a great way of countering franchise creep. Black Mirror did the same thing, where creating interesting individual stories prevents you from feeling overwhelmed by the expanse of the world. Black Mirror and Fargo both have interconnectedness between the anthology stories, and fans will definitely dive into that. But if you're just watching expecting a small, short, standalone story, you can get that as well. When shows grow the beard, they understand that they don't need to rely on cheap tricks to get audience to come back. You jump the shark when you have to rely upon cliffhangers, massive teasers, post-credit scenes in order to get audiences excited. Growing the beard allows an audience to be excited at the quality of the show itself. Curb Your Enthusiasm has been airing for, 24 years now, and every season feels fresh because it's exciting and interesting and well written. It doesn't feel like it's continuing for the sake of money. God knows Larry David doesn't need any more of that, but because they want to tell new and interesting stories. If you have an example of a TV show or a movie or a video game that you think jumped the shark or grew the beard, in fact, I'd probably prefer growing the beard. I'd like to watch good stuff rather than bad stuff. Please put it in the comments. I'd definitely check it out. Original content has taken a sideline as franchise era has become the dominant form of media consumption. But it's very interesting to see just how much the franchise era has fatigued an audience. Madam Web's massive box office flops, the fact that Sydney Sweeney didn't even realize that Madam Web wasn't a part of the MCU. But honestly, does it really matter? How much do we really care about the interconnectedness of the worlds in which we're engaging with? So much of it feels like an artificial way to generate engagement from an audience. Because the more content someone consumes, the more money the studios make. Who knows when the franchise era will come to an end? I think we're definitely seeing the downfall of it, but be wary of when the things you love jump the shark. Because it happens all the time in both television and franchise entertainment. And honestly, once you notice that peak, sometimes it's best to stop watching. But thank you for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this analysis of franchise entertainment. It's something I've been thinking about a lot recently. I feel like every time I see a new announcement for a new franchise stuff, I get really tired now. I used to get really excited about it, but now it's just I've become numb to it almost. And not in a way that like, oh, all franchises are bad. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I don't know, if you're excited about something coming up that you think actually will be good, please put in the comments. I'd like to see it. If you say, oh, there's a trailer for this adaptation of a video game I really like, and I think this is going to be good. Awesome. I love those. So let me know in the comments below. But thank you. Please subscribe and like and all of those things. And I'll see you next time. Goodbye.